people are going to stay a really long time to take it. It shouldn't take you 2 hours to finish it. And if at 2:30 everybody is gone, I'm leaving. so if you decide at that particular moment that that's when you're going to show up, then you might be out of luck. My recommendation is be here at 1:45 when the exam is supposed to start. All right? So, great. Yes, Jessica.
I have a class before this with you. Is it just the same times during class? Oh yeah, are we not having exam because of the project?
We'll be done by that time. We're done at 12:50 in the last class. So yeah, you should be free and clear to go ahead and do this exam at 1:45. So,
okay.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you come in earlier or not that day.
Well, you're going to need to be here for the previous class, but for the exam itself, it won't start until 1:45. Okay. Other questions? Anybody else? Okay. I am going to stall off doing question of the day until the end of the class today, just because there's so much I want to get through. Today is our last meeting time, so there will be no class in here on Monday. No class Monday in here, not in this class. So next week is final exam week, and somebody else will be using this classroom for their exams on Monday, so it won't be us. So that's why we're done today. I have to finish the lectures today, and so I'm going to jump right into them. And then if we have time at the end of the class, then we'll do question of the day. So here. Answer any other questions that you might have at that time as well. So Kelly, would you mind hitting the lights for us, please? Okay, good. All right, so we left off and we were talking about the dude named Tibor Kalman. Anybody remember anything about him or anything I said about him? Or what this is all about? What's this about?
What I remember was the fact that he wanted to make it like old and run down, but at the same time, like the food was all like high-end food. Like, yeah. But I mean, it is kind of interesting to see a classical work for. Like, I almost feel like in some ways though, some people would like judge the book by its cover and think it's terrible food in a way, but it's just kind of.
Yeah, no, this is kind of the thing about Tibor, was that he was always trying to push people to break out of their norms and not to judge. So one of the projects that he did, I don't have it up here, but one of my favorite projects that he did was for Christmas one year as a promo. He sent out sandwiches to all the design firms throughout New York City, all the big name firms. It was boxed lunches, and it was the kind of lunch that you would get at a homeless shelter. And so it was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and an apple and a carton of milk or something like that. So he sent this to every single office, and then he also put $5 into the bottom of the box. And he said that if you donate $5 to a homeless shelter, this is what you provide for them. So it was kind of encouraging people to donate more than $5. They could take that $5 and pocket themselves and use it for something, but what he was really trying to do is he was trying to encourage them to think about not only donating that $5, but donating $5, $10, $20, whatever dollars of their own out of their own pocket, kind of goading them into it. So here's a really deeper thinker than.
There's another psychologist called social engineering.
What about it?
Is there other psychologists called social engineering kind of stuff?
I don't know if it falls into social engineering. When I think about social engineering, I think about the Holocaust and all of that stuff.
No, I mean more like how it's sort of like getting somebody to do something by providing them with like an option, kind of like, okay, here, this is, you sort of solve this problem, sort of like an answer to a question.
Yeah. Well, that was the kind of person that Tibor was. He was one of those that really was constantly, especially on the case of designers, especially in the case of his clients. He encouraged them.
Sorry.
He encouraged them. This is an ad for Restaurant Florent. That was an ad that he encouraged his client to put out for the restaurant. Has absolutely nothing to do with the restaurant itself. Has everything to do with a social commentary. And that was really, again, the thing that he was encouraging people to do. It's like push away from what the norms are. Push away from what everybody expects you to do. Yeah, you can put a fancy label on this restaurant, but if you really actually want your restaurant to stand out, the way to do it is to be different from everybody else. And that's what he was encouraging here. And at the same time, he really enjoyed the idea of using things that were the everyday objects and turning them, twisting them, doing weird things with them so that people had to think about them twice. So when he was hired to do this signage for a new apartment building complex, he decided to pull up things that looked very, what we call quotidian, everyday, ordinary. So that they didn't necessarily stand out by themselves, but by putting them together in this kind of combination, they did stand out. And then he would just do stuff like this, you know, it's like, okay, it's a standard clock face, there's really nothing exciting or different about it, the font, nothing really interesting there, but by scrambling the numbers up, it makes you have to think about it twice, and think about it in a new and interesting way. I put Tibor Kalman into this category of retro. And the reason I did that was because he uses things from the past, or uses things that are, you know, that are pretty ordinary looking, and then does a new variation on design on them. But he's not like the others that we talked about in the retro fashion. Those others in the retro fashion were really trying to play off of a style from the past. In the case of Tibor Kalman, he was working with the things that were just the ordinary stuff and restyling them so that they had kind of a new, unique look. And then getting back into that topic of him being a push, you know, trying to push people to think outside of the norms. At one point he was asked to design, or actually he approached one of his clients, which was United Colors of Benetton, and he encouraged them to create a publication, a magazine, that again would go out to the design community, because he knew that designers were really, they could do what he was doing. They could push their clients to try to think outside of the norm and try to do things in an extraordinary way. So the magazine that they created was called Colors. And Colors magazine was meant to be provocative. It did not talk about the store, the retail operation, United Colors of Benetton, in any way, shape, or form. Instead, they took on topics that were kind of taboo or strange things that were happening in society. So, child labor laws, or AIDS, or human trafficking, or pollution, or anything that was like a topical subject that really didn't have much to do with the graphic design community, but that he wanted designers to understand and to get knowledgeable about in order to help them push for those causes for among their clients. So with United Colors with Colors magazine, he was the art director and the editorial designer as well for this publication, and what he did with this was he actually re-educated a lot of people about the AIDS crisis. So when AIDS was really showing its ugly head back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, people didn't really know what it was about. It was a mysterious disease, and people just thought that by being in the same room with somebody with AIDS that you could get it. And they didn't realize that they were literally like causing these folks that were HIV positive to be set aside from everybody else, like they were lepers of some sort. So he wanted people to have a better education about what it was about, and that's what this particular cover was about, and what all of the issues of Colors magazine were about. Sadly for us, Tibor is no longer with us. He unfortunately died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma back in, what year was it? I want to say it was 1995. Do I have it in here? No, I don't. No, I don't. But he died in the 1990s from that horrible disease, so he's not with us anymore. But he was always encouraging designers to go to the extreme. Like for another example, and again, you know, kind of P.T. Barnum kind of antics, the way that he went about these things. Like at one time there's an organization called AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts, very large organizations, thousands and thousands of members, and they have these conferences that happen every year, and people come from all over the country to attend. And one year they were giving out an award to fashion retailer, Esprit. And they were going to give it away to Esprit for their good design aesthetics. And Tibor Kalman like leafleted this conference. So he stood out in front and he had a couple of his students and his employees working with him, and they were just handing out leaflets left and right, and they were pointing out the fact that Esprit, who is getting this award, hires child labor and pays them, from China, and they pay them 10 cents per day or something ridiculous like that, and question the fact that Esprit should be getting this award. So that's the kind of thing that Tibor Kalman did. He was always trying to push people and make them think a little bit more than just the superficial surface. And we can thank him for that, because he really did push design in a new direction, or design thinking in a new direction. Another form of postmodernism is one that we call grunge. And I think grunge has pretty much died out at this point, but it still rears its ugly head. Literally, in some ways, to this day. Usually it's in more the front of DIY, which is kind of its offspring, its child. But when we talk about grunge, the thing that I really want people to recognize is that this was kind of born out of the new wave aesthetic. So that style that we saw with Wolfgang Weingart, it's really there that these people that started to develop the grunge aesthetic were playing off of. That, in fact, they're breaking all the rules regarding traditional typesetting, like New Wave was doing. However, the big difference between New Wave and grunge, no grid in grunge. No grid ever, ever, ever in grunge. They don't care about grids. It's a big middle finger to the whole idea of the Swiss aesthetic. They do use a tool for production, which was something that was very new to New Wave, but this is at least 10 years removed from when New Wave came about. And so now the computer is a full-fledged tool for most grunge designers, and they use it for their production. The idea of it is one that pushes away from that consumerist ideology. They really have this attitude of disdain towards anything that's commercial. And so you can think about those grunge artists that this is kind of named off of, like Nirvana and Hole and Alice in Chains and all of those groups that came out. And the whole idea of being popular, making lots of money, was really something that they kind of gagged on. They hated that whole idea. And so that's where grunge has its roots at. The other thing that I want to point out about grunge is that it was really meant to be a typographic movement. So it wasn't necessarily that they were doing something for the sake of just being messy and dirty, that the core of what they were doing was really about type revolution, a new version of this new wave mentality, but was really focused entirely on typography. And so the folks that were the creators, really, that's where they started to do this development, this ripping things apart, this deconstruction that they did. They did it through the typography, and then it moved outward from typography into the entire layouts. So just having a layout that is dirty looking, that is not enough to call it grunge. It really stems from the idea of trying to be rebellious with typography and breaking all of the rules of typography, including things like margins and alignments, or even readability. All of those things are kind of pushed away, pushed aside, not important for the folks that were the creators of grunge. The person that we want to focus on here, the real guy that was the leader of the pack here, was a guy named Neville Brody. I shouldn't say was, he is, he still exists. But Neville Brody was really very experimental from a very early age. He was of the same generation that Wolfgang Weingart was, and he was experimenting around the same time that Wolfgang Weingart was going to school and experimenting on his own. So for Neville Brody, he really just found that his generation had shifted out of that hippie culture and was moving towards this new genre that we call punk. And so anybody here know anything about punk, the punk music genre? What do you know, Jessica?
It's like, I don't know if this is what, but whenever I hear punk, this is what I think of. leather studded jackets, dyed hair, bikes, very loud rock heavy music, and disobedience.
Why? Why were they all those things? What do you think, Adam?
I just was sort of British, Iggy Pop and sort of like old school punk guys. It's just sort of rebelling against the system. It's, it's the whole, oh god, what's it called, military industrial complex. Oh,
Yeah, I mean,
lack of better words.
everything that we said about postmodernism and why it started to rise, it was embodied in this punk genre. They were opposed to everything that had come before them, including the whole hippie aesthetic. That the hippies had started to become part of the establishment, and so that generation, the next generation that followed that hippie generation, they looked at them and they were disappointed because they had said peace, love, rock and roll, let's make the world a better place. And then, they started getting corporate jobs and taking money and buying houses and doing all the things that their parents had done before them. And so this punk generation came up and they were really, really pissed about it, and they let it come out in their music and they let it come out in their graphics. So for a lot of folks, when they started to see what was happening here with Neville Brody and the folks that were following him into this grunge aesthetic, they first started to call this punk graphics, and so that those terms are kind of interchangeable, punk and grunge. But eventually, grunge evolved beyond just this kind of musical genre and into a complete attitude. For Neville Brody, as a student, he was always breaking the rules. He was always finding himself at odds with his teachers. At one point, he had designed a stamp. There was a project that the class had to do that had to design a stamp with Queen Elizabeth on it, and he absolutely hated the idea of doing a traditional stamp, and so he flipped her upside down, put lipstick on her face and all that stuff. And his professors were really mad at him because he was disrespecting. And to him, it's like, but you guys disrespected us. It was just that was how he looked at it. So he didn't do very well in school. He did graduate, but he wasn't really excited about what they were teaching him at school. Instead, what he was really excited about was this punk music scene that was going on in London at the time. He used to hang out with a lot of these artists, because he had training in graphic arts, they would ask him, "Can you design our CD covers for us?" And so he did. So he took on Cabaret Voltaire as one of his clients. He took on Eight Eyed Spy and various other groups. The one thing that he really enjoyed was looking at past designs trends, what had happened in the past. And one of the things that he was really intrigued by, which fit into this punk generation, was Dadaism. What was Dadaism again? What was the methodology or the thinking behind Dada? Once again, somebody besides Adam.
There wasn't any, right?
There wasn't any. Well, there was, but what was Dada trying to say?
You're just being ridiculous or something?
Yeah, that's what they were saying. They were saying, it's like, okay, what is art? Anything is art. As far as we're concerned, we're just going to take anything and we're going to incorporate it and call it art. And you can say it's art or not, but whatever, that's how we're going to regard it. And so that's what he started to do, what Neville Brody started to do. He would take images from other places and he'd incorporate them, cut them apart, and recycle them and use them on these covers for the CDs that he was developing for these guys. And one of the things that he really enjoyed doing, especially, was taking traditional typography and cutting it apart and using it in the stuff that he was doing. So a lot of times he was creating graphics like this that were really just letter forms that he was cutting apart and putting back together again and creating new kinds of icons out of them, or taking type that was not that tall and just cutting it down until it became really, really squat like what he did there, because there weren't a lot of fonts available to them at this time. This is 1980. And so all the traditional fonts that were available, that's what he had to choose from. So he didn't even have computer fonts to work from. And later on he did, but he really wasn't happy with those either. Anyhow, what he was doing with typography, what he was doing with this idea of cutting things apart, recycling them, paid off for him, because immediately after that he was hired by a magazine called The Face. to come on and be an art director for them. So he came in and he started to do that same kind of idea of hodgepodging the typography, cutting it apart, using it for the designs that he was doing. So they became new type. It really became interesting and fresh new kinds of typography. And the other thing that he really liked was the idea of metamorphosizing the designs, so that he wasn't just using it once, but he could recycle it again and again and again and again, and just make tiny little changes to it. For example, in 1 year's time with the Face magazine, this would happen slowly over a month-by-month increment because it was a monthly magazine. He would take the word contents, which he would use as like an icon that would sit on the corner of the page someplace. He would use that word contents and have it like that in one issue of the magazine. Then like 3 or 4 issues later, it would have morphed it so that it looked like this. And then he would continue to morph it in the subsequent issues, so that by the time the end of the year came, it didn't even look like letter forms anymore. This was the icon for contents. But if you followed the magazine, if you looked at it from month after month, you would have seen that slow progression to get to that point, and it was kind of training the readers to understand what it was that they were talking about. And further, that idea of recycling came in a lot of forms in the magazine. Like, for example, with this particular article that he developed, not only is he doing that cutout with the letters and reformulating, creating new letter forms through other letter forms and just making this whole new alphabet of it, but he also would recycle the stories. So if you look at this, you can see that letter W is actually meant to be a letter M from a previous issue of the publication on a story about Madonna. And so it's got, not only has it got the letter M here, it's got a little picture of Madonna, or a portion of the picture of Madonna that's cut off on the corner here. And the words on the story say, the girl can't help it. She wanted to dance, sing, anything, as long as the, and that's where it cuts off. So it's like, okay, that doesn't make any sense, but it kind of does, because this is Andy Warhol that the story is about. And Andy Warhol was all about superficiality and poking back at this consumer society and having this kind of vacuous superficial surface that nobody could really penetrate. And so he's doing that also in the way that he's treated the letter O in Andy Warhol's name by putting that little plus sign above it. It's the inversion of the female figure that we use as a symbol for male and female. So this is the little plus sign. By turning it upside down, it's talking about the ambiguity of Andy Warhol's sexuality, because he was known to be gender confused. And so that kind of ties again into that she's got to dance, she's got to sing, to what the story is. That's the kind of thinking, craziness that was going on in Neville Brody's style, and he was very, very popular for like pushing the edge of what the thinking was to the publications. It wasn't just a superficial reasoning for doing things anymore. Now he was recycling and he was rethinking the way that design could work. The problem with this was that after a while, his style became so popular, especially what he was doing with typography, became so popular that people started to corrupt it, and they were using it all over the place. And Neville Brody got really pissed about it. He felt like, they're ripping me off. I spent a lot of time developing these ideas. I spent a lot of time cutting these letter forms apart. And now they're just like doing the same thing that I've been doing all along. I don't like that. So instead, when he was hired by a sister publication for The Face, Arena magazine, which is a men's magazine, the other one was an entertainment magazine, but Arena was a men's magazine. When he was hired for Arena magazine, he said, you know what? I'm going to show them. I'm going to work with Helvetica. That'll teach them. I'm going to work with Helvetica. There's nothing plainer, simpler, non-conventional, or conventional than Helvetica. So other than the masthead that's shown there, the rest of the magazine was done completely in Helvetica. However, because Neville Brody is who Neville Brody is, when he started to design, he got really bored with Helvetica really fast, and he started to do the same thing that he was doing before. He kept the quality of what Helvetica was. He refused to morph or change the letter forms, but he started to rethink the way that letter forms could be put together. And so, like, I don't have any layouts for Arena magazine, but here's one of the advertisements that he did for Nike. You might have heard of them, using nothing but the font Helvetica, and changing the way that he is changing the sizes and controlling the way that it looks overall. And this became kind of his trademark, the way that people started to recognize Neville Brody's work. He originally didn't advocate using the computer. He hated the idea of what the computer was doing, but unfortunately he had a client that required that he do their project on the computer, and so he trained himself on how to use a Macintosh computer, but he was immediately put off by the horrible fonts that he was finding on the computer. The same ones that Abel Greiman was facing, where it's all kind of chiseled and stair-stepped and not really looking very good. And this is before Matthew Carter stepped in and designed Verdana, Georgia. And so he started to do the exact same thing with fonts when on the computerized fonts, and started to create a whole mess of different kinds of fonts that he thought, okay, if we're going to go for this kind of unique machine that's going to construct fonts for us, let's have some fun with fonts. Instead of just going to traditional Helvetica, Garamond, Baskerville, Bodoni, Century, the ones that are the corporate standard, I'm going to create fonts that are just eccentric and wild. And that's exactly what he did. And it wasn't just him, he had partners in this, so he ended up working with a company called Fontworks, he formed a company called Fontworks in London, and then he formed a sister partnership with a guy named Eric Spiekerman, who was in Amsterdam at that time, and developed another company called Font Shop. And together they were creating all kinds of weird, crazy fonts that really made people kind of blink twice, because again, the corporate fonts were all the traditional kinds and not very original or forward-thinking kind of fonts. In the case of Neville Brody, he wanted to do something that was extreme. We have this new device, we have this new technology, let's do something fun with our type. And that's what he started to do. And so through Fontworks, he started to sell his fonts. And the thing, he called this the Fuse Project. And the Fuse Project was a subscription base for buying fonts. So if you were a new computer user and you were really, again, like him, feeling like these fonts are just so boring, I want to do something more interesting, you could go to something, to Fuse, and you could subscribe. And a lot of people did this. They would end up doing the subscription. It cost $10, and every $10 a month, kind of like what Netflix and all of those are. But instead of getting Netflix, you would get a package, and inside of it, every 3 months you would get a package, and inside of it you would have a floppy disk that had the newest, latest, greatest fonts that Neville and his partners had developed. And usually there were 3 fonts within that package, so you had 3 new fonts that you could load into your computer and start playing with immediately. And then on top of it, they also included with that posters that showed what these fonts looked like in their finished form. So you could play with he would design out, so you would see what that particular font looked like, and then you could see the entire alphabet, and that would give you a little bit of information. You could hang these on your walls, and people were buying into this. And this is the way a lot of people ended up getting fonts on their computers that, in those early days, was through the Fuse Project and others like it. So Neville Brody, again, pushing the edge with typography. The other person that is, well, one other person that is considered a part of this grunge movement is a designer named David Carson. And he was working a little bit later than what Neville Brody was doing. Neville had already been pretty established in the industry at this point, but David Carson came up into the 1990s, the early 1990s, just as the grunge movement of music was really taking off. In his own way, David Carson kind of blundered into this accidentally, and so a lot of people don't have a tremendous amount of respect for what David Carson was doing, because he wasn't classically trained and I don't think that's a precursor for not being respected as a designer, but he wasn't really adhering to the same kind of things that Neville Brody was doing. Neville Brody was really about rebellion. David Carson was rebellious, but it was more accidental in his rebellion. He didn't know any better. And I say that because he originally started out as a school teacher. He was a psychology teacher at a high school, and the only way that he ended up getting involved in graphics was because as an instructor, one of the things that he had to do as an extracurricular assignment was help them develop their yearbook every year. Somebody's got to do it. So Neville Brody was the one that was hired as the yearbook advisor for the yearbook group, and so they would have to put together mechanicals and set the type and all of that stuff for their yearbooks. And so David Carson would end up talking to printers, understanding a little bit about the print process, and got involved that way. The other thing about David Carson was that he was a semi-professional surfer. He had competed in many big contests out on the East Coast in California. That's where he came from. And so he was a semi-professional surfer and hung around with this kind of crowd of people, surfers. So by being in that group, he was like right at the forefront when this new magazine called Rag On, which was actually before that it was Surfer Magazine, were sponsoring events and being there on location, and he would meet these folks. And they were, at some point somebody said, hey, we've got, this new magazine, and we need somebody to design it. And David Carson's like, well, I know how to put together mechanicals, so they hired him to do this. But in his mind, he was really doing the best that he could possibly do. In some ways, he was really pushing extremes. In other ways, he was kind of blundering into it. In any case, what he came across was trying to really push the edge of readability and working with some really bad quality imagery and putting together these layouts for the various magazines that he was working on. So he worked for Beach Culture, he worked for Surfer Magazine, worked for Rag On Magazine, which are all three of them were by the same organization that was producing them. They're kind of a high-end version of a zine, if you know what a zine is. A zine's more like a low printing budget, kind of handcrafted magazine with some sponsorship, some advertising in them, but mostly storytelling. In any case, he started to do these magazines for Beach Culture, for Rag On, for Surfer Magazine, and over and over again, he was using some really bad quality images that he had, that people would supply to him, and his goal was to try to make them as interesting as possible. So he really just kind of pushed the edge of what readability was, and started to do that same thing that Neville Brody had done, cutting letter forms apart or cutting into the letter forms, or not really holding true to the ideas of how you're supposed to make words work. Jessica?
No, I'm just stretching. I'm like really sore right now.
That's okay. And so his layouts kind of became a hodgepodge, a montage of really interesting compositions that were really difficult to read. And a lot of people hated what he was doing because it was so difficult to read. And other people that were part of this generation and this kind of cultural shift, they adored it. They thought it was great. It said everything that they wanted to say about the generation before them. As far as David Carson was concerned, his defense of what he did was that if it's an interesting story, then people will find a way to read it no matter what. And so that's what he was promoting here. It's like, okay, if you do something really well, then it doesn't matter what the graphics are, it doesn't matter what the typography is, it will still be readable. And so he did these more intuitively than he did as design solutions. In many cases, he was designing on the spot, and he would come across problems that he had to solve. Like, for example, this is the cover for Rag On Magazine, and he had a block of copy that was left over from previously inside the magazine that he couldn't figure out where to put, so he decided, I'll just put it on the cover. So it's continued from page 37 to the cover, which, again, is kind of like, all right, well, sure, okay, let's do that. over and over again, he was really just like saying, okay, if I turn the type sideways, if, you know, where are we supposed to begin? Well, people will figure it out. Or in this particular case, he decided that he was going to have the type run all the way across both spreads and really densely laid out so that the type was practically touching baseline to baseline. And you know, so he didn't care about the production issues, and he didn't care about the fact that people can have really hard time reading anything more than 6 inches wide. When you go to this, it's like, okay, I can't read that. Well, maybe I could if I were really interested in this, or I would find a way to do it. And that's what he was really trying to do. And sometimes he felt like the story was so boring that it didn't even deserve to be put into a typeface that was readable. So in this particular case, he set the entire story about the artist Brian Ferry, and he put it into Zap Dingbats. And so you could actually like try to decipher this. You could go through it and read it, you know, character for character, and try to decipher it. Actually, further in the magazine, they have the translation of this, but this is just like him making a point. A lot of the authors, the writers who were working on this magazine were really pissed at him about what they were doing. As far as they were concerned, he was just like monkeying around with their works. However, again, it really took off with this youth market that were part of this whole attitude. And they loved it, and they, to the point where the advertisers kept on coming back and saying, hey, whatever you're doing, do more of it. And then authors started to come back and say, hey, what you did on that last issue, do it to my story too, do it. And just pushing him to try to be as extreme as possible. As far as extreme goes, this is probably the most extreme that you can get. This is a story about a blind surfer. So there's actually words on the page. They're there. They're underneath black ink. So it's actually a blue type that is typed on the entire page, filling the space up, and then the black ink is laid over top of it. So when you look at it, if you turn it to the side like this and you kind of squint your eyes at it, you can make out the words. But you can't see it when you look straight on. And so as far as David Carson was concerned, this was about understanding what it was to be blind, to go through that experience, and that's what he was saying here. So again and again, he was playing with this whole idea of magazines and what you could do with them, and really pushing the edge. The problem with him is that the style of what he was doing took off like a rocket. People either loved it or they hated it, but it was very controversial. A lot of people were talking about it. And here's where I say that he really wasn't adhering to the ideology of what the whole, what this whole grunge attitude was, because grunge just kind of like felt like anything that was commercial you wanted to gag yourself with. But in the case of David Carson, he, you know, kind of started to believe all his stories about his fame and how brilliant he was. And so he would take on these speaking engagements and then decide, oh, I don't want to show up for that. Or take their money and then only give them 10 minutes worth of a lecture and then leave and, you know, pick up girls along the way, and it became kind of a dog. So not really a savory character. He's still around, I will say, but he's not really quite doing what he was doing before. This is probably one of his better pieces that he did for Nike. He just like with Neville Brody. Neville Brody did the Nike ad with the Helvetica. In the case of David Carson, he did an ad did a whole series of ads for Nike, kind of using his typographic aesthetic, just like Neville Brody had done with his own. After a while, David Carson kind of died out, and he's still doing stuff, but he's doing mostly video editing these days. Does some title sequences every once in a while. Not really too involved in the print world anymore these days. I guess he had a kid, and so that changed his attitude also. So in any case, he did just a few more things after that. Now he's kind of just like faded away a little bit. I hate to say bad things about people, but really.
Took a dive, huh?
Another pair that were very heavily into this grunge aesthetic was a married couple. Their name was Rudy Vanderlins and Susanna Licko. And neither one of them were from the United States. Rudy Vanderlins was from the Netherlands, and Susanna Licca was from Bratislava. That's where she came from. And so they called their magazine Emigre, and kind of a reflection of what their heritage was, that they were immigrants to the United States. But in any case, they met each other when they were both going to college at UC Berkeley. She was an undergrad and he was a graduate student, and they had met. He shortly after that got a job working for a newspaper. He came to the United States purposely thinking that the United States had the best design around, and so he wanted to design for a U.S. corporation. And then he realized once he got working into the newspaper industry that it really wasn't as great as he thought it was going to be. And so he was really disappointed, and he decided that he wanted to do something to capitalize on what his design training was and to really push his design a little bit further. And so in the evenings he started to write stories, articles about parts of the design field that he felt the big magazines weren't paying attention to. The big magazines at that time were Print Magazine and Communication Arts Magazine. Those were the two magazines that were tied to the graphic arts, and he felt that they were doing really crappy job of telling what was going on. People like David Carson and Neville Brody and Paula Scher and Tibor Kalman. He didn't think that they were covering them well enough. And so he started to write stories about them. The first issue that he produced was really written with typewriter type. Pulled out a typewriter, typed up his stories, and did layouts. And again, it was a zine. It was just low production standards printed off of a copier. By the time they got to the second, third, fourth issue, Susanna stepped in. Now, Susanna had grown up with a father who was a scientist, and he was a computer scientist. So he taught her how to use the computer before anybody knew how to use computers. She was doing computer when it was all code, when there was like no WYSIWYG, none of that. What you see is what you get. You type in code and you can make it work, and she could make it work. She was designing fonts for her father when she was 12 years old. That's how into it she was. So when Rudy started to put together this publication that he was calling Emigre, she said, well, why don't I just design some fonts for you? This is ridiculous that you're using a typewriter type. I can do better than that. And so she did. She started to put together typefaces that would be used in the issue. And they decided early on that took a while for her to develop it, but they figured she could do a new design every month. She could do a new font design every month. And so they decided, well, let's just tie this together with our publication. So every month they would put out a new Emigre, and every month it would have a different font being used. It was one of Susanna's fonts. And that way she was doing something that she felt was fulfilling, he was doing something that he felt was fulfilling, and the magazine started to flourish. It really started to take off. And one of the things that people started to ask immediately was, where can I get that font? So they decided, okay, well, I think we need to sell our fonts. And so that's what they did. They started to sell these fonts that Susanna was creating in this publication that they were writing called Emigre. And so the fonts really took off, and they would, in fact, they would make it so that if you bought a font, you got a free subscription to the magazine. So the magazine spread out that way, and so on. And every month they would produce a new story, and after a while they started to have like guest writers like David Carson come in and start to write issues for the magazine. But in their case, Rudy was trying to do something really interesting, and he was kind of pushing the same edge that David Carson and Neville Brody were pushing as far as the legibility and readability of fonts, readability of layouts. So, for example, in one issue of Emigre magazine, using the same font in the various weights, Rudy decided to have an entire story fill up the entire magazine from start to finish. So it started on page 1 or page 2, whatever, and run all the way to the end of the magazine, say page 16 of it. And then side by side with it, he would have another story going concurrently through those same pages. And then another story going through those same pages. So he had 3, 4, 5 stories all going simultaneously on every single page of the magazine. That's a different way of thinking, but that's what Rudy Vanderlins was trying to do. He was not afraid of making you turn the pages around or doing weird things with them or playing with scale and all of that stuff. So in Emigre, they were finding some really fresh ways of approaching design. So that's grunge. And then we get to this new direction that we're moving into with postmodernism, to the point that we can even ask, is it postmodernism anymore? Are we even talking about consumerism? Are we even talking about grids and all of that stuff? Or have we really evolved to something that's different? To which, it's like, okay, if we are evolving to something different, what do we call this? Is this late modernism? It really comes down to this. Are we in the same kind of mindset that we were in the 1980s when postmodernism came along? And I'd say probably not. Yeah, I don't think that we're the same people anymore, that society has changed, culture has changed, we're moving things around. We can start to see that happening in design. For example, when we start to look at design, not only are we seeing this reverence to the past and its qualities in here that we can say that they're reminiscent of something of the past, but we're actually starting to see this kind of fusion starting to happen. So we might have things that look like they're old woodcuts or old engravings that are put together with things that look like they're Swiss in the design thinking. Or we might have things that we have this idea of the maybe modernist period that's kind of tying into colors that are reminiscent of the California style, but with grids. So we have this kind of mishmash, where we got the hand lettering of modernism that's being incorporated into this idea of using grids. Or we have a corporate entity like Vassar, well-known school, utilizing type treatments that are kind of reminiscent of grunge. So all kinds of strange things are happening, and the message is not the same as what the people that had originally created those messages were talking about. We also have corporations that are really blowing up and becoming icons unto themselves, so that we don't even need to see what the name of the company is anymore to recognize what the brand is. We get that. And they're just becoming behemoths unto themselves. We certainly know who the company is that made this product, but we don't see the logo anywhere. It's not there, not anymore. And so we get it. Like that was really endemic when we saw those Mac versus PC ads that were out about 10 years ago, if you guys are familiar with those, where John Hodgman played PC and what's his name, Justin Long, playing Mac. And they, again, never showed the logo on these advertisements, but people got it, they recognized it, and at the time when this was coming out, they could just hear the little music playing in the background, and they would recognize that that was a Macintosh commercial. Now the storefronts themselves don't look like stores anymore, and so everything's changing as far as design goes, and it certainly isn't the same kind of thinking that we had back in the 1980s when postmodernism was really coming about. It's become more like a fusion in many regards. So we might look at this and we might recognize that there's elements here that are reminiscent of grunge, reminiscent of retro, all kind of tied together in the things that they're doing, old woodcut kind of images. Does this remind anybody of Man with the Golden Arm in some regards? Yeah, we see it. And then at the same time, we can see psychedelic influences happening here. And this was designed in the 2000s. You can see .com up there at the top. So this is not something old, and this is not something old either. The date on this is 2009, but it's reminiscent of the psychedelic era meets grunge meets Bradbury Thompson in some ways. Even Paula Scher is pushing the world around by melting the idea of that pushpin influence together with super graphics in some of the things that she's been designing. And one of the newest trends that's really kind of come to light, one that we can actually put a term to, is the movement called DIY. And we can call it postmodernism, we can call it late modernism, but we definitely want to call it DIY, a DIY form of either postmodernism or late modernism. So what we recognize with DIY is that it was born out of grunge. It started with grunge. Grunge and the attitude of grunge is really what's there. But what we're pulling into it is this hand-drawn, handcrafted kind of style that's happening here. The thing about the DIY movement that sets it apart from grunge is that grunge was using the computer as a tool to create things, and things were being done on the computer. It was as much a tool as your pencil and paper are a tool. For the folks that are part of the DIY movement, there's actually kind of a disdain for the computer and for technology. There's almost a pushback on it and saying, I think I want to go back to doing things the old way, kind of like the pre-Raphaelites, like the pre-Raphaelites where we hate the machine is taking away man's tie to his environment. Well, that's what the DIYers are saying. They're saying that we're getting so locked into these computers that we're not using our own brains to think, and so they're pushing away from that. And ultimately, there's this kind of ironic view of society that is part of the DIY movement. It's no longer talking about consumerism, it's really kind of talking about how stupid society is, just in general. So examples of DIY aesthetic. The title sequences for the movie Napoleon Dynamite. They're using common, this is kind of the Tibor Tallman idea, pulling in common everyday items and building the design around them. So, we got, the tater tots and business cards and school IDs and all of these things that are part of the movie that they're incorporating as part of this of the title sequence that goes into the movie. That's the DIY aesthetic that they're using. They're doing everything by hand, not using the computer to build these graphics. It's all done by hand. Or the title sequence for the movie Juno is another good example of this, where they've taken these videos that are taken, and instead of doing something super slick and over graphic on them, they've taken it back down to simple animation techniques of just drawing over the screen and having the body kind of floating into that space and hand lettered once again. So, and others are doing this, picking up on this idea of the hand lettered stuff and doing things that, again, have kind of a Dada aesthetic to them, but not relying upon the computer to create that anymore. Now it's got a kind of a hand-drawn quality to it, and a hand-conceived quality to it. Very thoughtful concepts, though. Probably the person that is the best embodiment of this DIY movement, at least at this point, is a guy named Stefan Sagmeister. And Stefan Sagmeister really took this idea of DIY to a very radical departure. It was no longer grunge, it really became its own entity unto itself. So for this particular poster, it's a call for entries into an awards program that is being given away by Adobe computer people. And what he's done is he's created this picture of the award. And it's made out of coffee cups sitting on the floor and photographed from above. And each one of those coffee cups is filled with a small quantity of coffee with milk in it, varying degrees. So you get the whole idea of each one of those coffee cups has a different kind of coffee in it, different flavored version of coffee in it, and shooting it from above. And so the whole work here is all done by hand. This guy down here is literally pouring coffee into those cups. And this whole thing was created on a studio floor. And then, just afterwards, they threw these things that they were creating, that they had to put in. But most of the typography here is hand lettered. So there's not a whole lot of computer work other than creating the mechanical part of it. This is the way that Tibor Tallman works. He has kind of a bit of disdain for the graphic arts. So here, every couple of years, he does a little sabbatical for himself. He'll go off and he'll do art instead. And then he'll put together gallery shows that that kind of center around the art that he's created, or the graphic explorations that he's created. So for this one, he did a gallery show where he built a wall that was made out of nothing but bananas with an affirmation that is spoken into it. And so as time went on, those bananas started to age, and by the time the show was over, when it closed, this is what the banana wall looked like. He has a long time relationship with the designer Annie Sweet, and so when he designed a promo piece for her, a promotional brochure, he did it so that he was printing, he just printed on newsprint paper. So it's just straightforward Xeroxed images onto this newsprint paper, and then he used an iron and literally ironed into the pages, so that it took about 5 minutes per piece to use a hot iron to burn through the pages like this. But that was one of the things that he did. And then when he actually has won a couple of Grammy Awards for graphic design. So he did the graphic interpretation for Lou Reed's album here. And he did this so that it was meant to expose the face of Lou Reed from one color out of the other, so the Twilight Reeling was the name of the album cover. This one's the one that really won him a Grammy, though. It was a CD for Mountains of Madness. And what he did was he printed green in one version of the photograph, and then he surprinted red over top of it, so that when it was put into the CD case, that was a red CD case, the green would show through when you looked at it in the one case, and then when you pulled it out of the case, then another case would emerge as a graphic image, so that it had two startling differences. Here's another one that he did for another AIGA conference, again showing kind of his disdain for the graphics industry. This is for one of those conferences, like what Tibor Kalman had leafleted. In this particular case, it took place down in New Orleans, and so he wanted to say something about New Orleans culture in this particular poster. So he found an image of chickens running around that he cut off their heads, saying something about the graphic industry being filled with chickens running around with their heads cut off, maybe they're senseless. And then he used like little chicken feet to create the letters hurry at the top there. And all of this is kind of evocative of not just Southern cooking, fried chicken and back porch and bayous and all of that stuff, but also evocative of the voodoo culture that is part of New Orleans as well. So it's all tied together into what he was doing. And then all of this, logos, all of those corporate logos that have to go on those silly posters, it's like, okay, fine, I'll just put them all on there. I don't care. I'll put them in some horrible order. It's going to look ugly, and that's okay. Because it's AIGA, you guys are designers, you guys think this is brilliant. So that's again another kind of mocking. Here's another one where he's using wagging tongues to say something about this lecture. A bunch of wagging tongues. Designers, of course, that he's mocking, who are the wagging tongues. And then this last one is probably his most famous of his posters that he's designed. This was for a lecture that he was giving at the Cranbrook Institute up in Detroit. And to do this, he said that he wanted to design his own poster to announce that he was coming to this lecture. And to do it, what he did was he had one of his assistants take an X-Acto blade and carve the words to this lecture, or the announcement, into his skin. So this is physically etched into his body, and then he had it photographed. Now, yes, it's kind of horrible to think about, but in truth, it was just superficial cuts. And somebody asked, did it hurt? He said, yes, it hurt. But at the same time, what he was trying to get across was the pain, the agony that designers will go through for their art. And so that's what he was really trying to say in this particular poster. There's a deeper meaning. It wasn't just like, I'm going to cut my body apart. It was really trying to get to the truth about what people suffer for their art. The funny story about this was, of course, it's all healed. He didn't have any scars for it. It was all fine. It was all superficial. But a year later, he was on a beach. He was sunning himself, and as he was sunning, his skin started to pick up this image once again on all the new skin that had grown in, so it was more tender, and so it showed up. These days he is still doing really thoughtful kind of designs. This one was designed for Nina papers, and Nina had asked all these different designers to design a graphic, a poster of some sort that had something to do with a character of the alphabet. And so Stefan Sagmeister took the comma, and in his mind he said our comma is in the elimination business, so he was using it to, but the thoughtful part about it is that, okay, yeah, you can liken that to a trigger and all of that stuff, and that's really, the thing with a comma is it makes you pause, so does a gun. Commas don't kill, though, guns do, and so he's making a little social message. I should also point out that he had at one point worked for Tibor Kalman. Get some of where he comes from. In any case, he's the last of the people that we're going to talk about today. What I want to show you guys here is just some of the names that we've been talking about. Some of you might recognize, I threw a few of them away as time went on, but a lot of these are the people that we've been looking at all along. And you're going to start to see that we've covered a lot. We've looked at a lot of different people as we've gone along this semester, and yeah, there's a lot that you still have to know yet, but you can start to see that the annals of design history are pretty thick. And it really comes down to, how these people all kind of fit together. They fit together because they understood history, they understood design. And what this class is meant to do is it's meant to arm you so that you can also fit into those annals if you want to. By understanding what it is that makes design work, recognizing that pulling in things from the past is a benefit to you, you can use that as a tool to make yourself better designers. And that's really what the goal is here. So, that's it. Any questions on any of this? Yes?
I know observation 5 is extra credit, but when does that due?
It's also due next Wednesday.
Okay.
So it needs to be turned in by midnight next Wednesday. Other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left if we want to do a question of the day. Yeah.
So is the final going to have images from the book on the test?
Yes, all the images that will be on the test are in the book. I just don't want you to do the reading from the book, because the reading from the book has all kinds of weird, wacky names for the things that we've been studying here, and the guide that I've been using is actually using another writer named Philip Meggs, following his curriculum as we get into postmodernism. So I don't like what Eskelsen did, but all the images are from the Eskelsen book. Okay. Others? Questions? Okay, do we want to do a question of the day? Last chance for extra credit? Who's got a question? Maybe we don't want to do question of the day.
Yeah, it's something good.
Wait, let's see if we can get an oldie.
All right, I'm just gonna call it. We're gonna call it a day here. Oh, I'm sorry, I had my head down. Take it back. Get back to your seat.
Sorry, I just fell over from this.
Kelly, what's your
It's just really
question?
Who was the designer that designed products for Target in the 90s?
Okay, who designed products for Target in the 1990s? Christopher.
Michael Graves.
That was correct, Michael Graves. Anything you want to add to that?
He also did products for J.C. Penney.
Did he do products for J.C. Penney?
Oh, that's what Wikipedia said. I don't know if that's right.
Okay, well, yeah, and he's like, okay, question about whether Wikipedia is right.
Yeah.
Did you have more to add to that?
No.
Anybody else more on this point, Peter?
Wasn't he originally designed like high-end stuff, but then he said good design should be there with everyone? So
Yep.
I don't know if you Target partnership.
Very good, yeah. And anything else, Mark?
Architectural.
Yeah, he's an architect. That's really where his training was. Okay, lots of points on that one. Anybody else got a question of the day? Cassidy?
What designer used Herbert Matter's poster?
Okay, who corrupted Herb Matter's poster for their own personal, or well, not personal gain, for their corporate gain? matters poster, Adam, who was it?
I was gonna say Enron, is that right?
No. Who was it? Anybody? Christopher?
Oh, Sharon?
Paula Scher would be correct. Anything that you want to add to that?
No.
Okay, be that way then. Anything that you want to add to that, Cassidy?
That it wasn't considered plagiarism because she asked for his permission.
That is correct. And did you have something else to add to that? No? That was it?
I have a question.
Go, yay.
Why is the Apple logo missing again?
Why is the what logo missing?
Apple logo? Apple logo. Yes, Apple logo.
Apple logo missing a button.
Missing again?
Missing a bite? You mean the bite out of the apple?
Oh, the Apple logo. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what's the significance of the Apple logo? Yeah, good question. Treat.
It has to do with like Adam and Eve and taking the bite and kind of changing the whole world.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else that you want to add to that?
No.
Their slogan was, take a bite out of the apple.
Yeah, take a bite. Take a bite. Anything else that you want to add to this conversation about Apple? The Apple logo. Anything else that you want to say?
No.
All right, guys, it's been fun. We're going to call it a day. Lots of points scored on that last little bit there. Good job.